Chapter 1 Growing Up Tipsy. Somehow I knew that there was much more going on than was apparent on the surface. My existence and that of things going on around me caused me to question everything, always looking for the deeper meanings. I was born in the city of the Voodoo, New Orleans, Louisiana. My paternal grandmother's shotgun house stands at 1018 St. Anne Street, the Maison Blanche, the former home of Mademoiselle Marie Laveau, the voodoo priestess for 3 generations, is recorded as being 1022 St. Anne Street. To this day, my grandmother's house carries a sign that reads, the Marie Laveau Apartments. New Orleans, like the San Francisco Bay Area, where I now live, is a psychic seaport. The psychic energies of many people living and dead hovers over the city of New Orleans, possibly because of the water. Visitors to the city become tipsy after being there only a short time. Tipsy is the name given to that state of mind that precedes possession. It is also understood and used to mean slightly drunk. I grew up tipsy. I spent many days and nights in the dark, mysterious house of my grandmother, Mama, Catherine Mason Allen, while my mother and father were at work. Due to the limited perceptions of a child and the nature of my memory, I can only describe it vaguely. I remember a big, too soft and bulky double bed in the middle room. This is the place where my cousin Frank Jr. took refuge from the whippings he always seemed to have earned. He used to hide under this bed and smoke cigarettes. But for me, smoke and Frank were not the only things hiding under that bed. Perhaps I had eaten too many pickles that night or overindulged in the delicious tea cakes and sweet potato turnovers my mama used to bake in the wood stove. Whatever the external cause, when I laid my head on the duck-down pillow covered with an immaculate muslin pillowcase, I just couldn't sleep. Everything was so still and quiet that I could not tell whether the numerous and barely distinguishable adult relatives of mine were asleep in the front room or out for a night of church. I could have been there alone without concern because everybody on the block was somehow kin to me and would have come running at the slightest disturbance. But tonight, as wind slipped slowly through the cracks in the wooden fence that enclosed the backyard, no one seemed afoot. At least, no one human. I could hear only the wind and the irregular tapping of Mama's white dog, who was born with only 3 legs. I was always afraid of that dog and kept a safe distance between us, not because he was in any way vicious, but because his eyes were always red, and I had been told that he knew when somebody was going to die. I lay there listening to this tap dance against the window, and I stared at the ceiling thoughtlessly. After a period of time that I cannot judge, a feeling of apprehension began to creep over me. Somebody, or something, was moving snake-like and slowly under the bed. Was it Frank? Had he crawled under it to avoid a whipping and fallen asleep? Had Mama's creepy dog gotten under the house and situated himself directly beneath the bed? When I asked myself these questions, the wind told me, no shit. As my fear mounted, I became aware of the sensation of lifting subtly. My back seemed not to touch the buttons of the mattress. I kept rising and rising until I seemed to be 5 feet above the bed. I remember thinking that if I kept rising like this, I was going to bump into the ceiling and smash my already flat nose. I want to go down, I said nervously inside my head. And at that moment, my face seemed to sink through the back of my head so that my chest and feet were still facing the ceiling, but my face was looking down at the bed. And what a sight it saw. There under the bed was an undulating sinew mass of matter, as brown as the waters of the muddy Mississippi River. It was squeezing out from under the bed on all sides like a toothpaste tube with pinholes in it. The brown was taking forms, humanoid but undistinguishable by gender. They were getting higher, showing heads with eyes, bellies, legs, outstretched arms, and I was getting closer to the bed. My face, now only a few inches from the sheet, returned to the other side of my head. And as my body descended, I looked at these brown humanoids towering over me. I seemed to shake uncontrollably. My muscles moved about as if I had no bones. I opened my mouth, screamed, but the sound was made only inside my head. The brown folks seemed to take a deep breath as my body settled on the mattress. They touched me, and their matter slipped into my muscles and ran through my veins. The floodgates opened, and as a warm, astringent liquid sank into the mattress, I sank into sleep. I remember telling my mother about this dream. She laughed, stroked my head, and asked me if I recognized any of the people who had come from under the bed. I told her, "No, ma'am," and the matter was forgotten. This happened when I was about 5 years old. 23 years later, I got a piece of an explanation of its meaning. A Puerto Rican woman water gazed for me and, without knowing my story, told me to make 2 dolls for my unknown ancestors and keep them under my bed. Across the street from Mama's house was a classic French Quarter home, complete with a veranda and cast iron lattice work. I used to sit on the top of my grandmother's house and stare at the balcony. There was a little girl, brown skinned, with 2 long black braids, who would grin to show me that she had no teeth. Then she would topple headfirst over the railing and disappear just as her head hit the banquet sidewalk. I don't know who she was or why she presented herself to me, but I saw invisible beings like this one all the time as a child. According to my mother, I used to get up in the morning and roam the French Quarter, sometimes not showing up again until sunset. At first, this alarmed her, but the neighbors soon took care of the problem. Renee, I saw Nickel Eye, my nickname, in the square this morning. She was on the Conti Street round lunch. Her and Mama Ruthie was down by the Levee on Canal Street yesterday evening. I remember Mama Ruthie as a fair-skinned, dark-haired, yellow-hammer mulatta who wore long skirts and big gold hooped earrings. I'm told that she used to come get me and we hang out all day. She used to tell her friends in the bars that we frequented that I was her baby and that my mother simply gave birth to and kept me for her. There is some mystery around the end of our relationship. All my mother would tell me was that my daddy didn't like her, that he forbid me to run around with her anymore, and that she died shortly after we stopped seeing each other. My own recollections of her came years later. When I began to meditate, I had visions of a little girl who looked like me in a long shirt, woman wearing bells, going to a place where an open fire burned and pretty girls danced with pumpkins on their heads. I cannot tell if this is fact or the product of my imagination. I may never know. Now, whenever I mention Mama Ruthie to my mother, she just opens her eyes wide and says, "You remember Mama Ruthie, baby?" In fact, I had not remembered her at all until 1973. I gave birth then to a child who died, and Mama Ruthie came in my meditation to comfort me. My father's family is very large and close to each other. We used to have family reunions, and it seemed as if the whole world was kin to me. Among this nation of people, I had some favorites. Papa Richard Allen, who was quiet and always gave me money. Uncle Richard Jr., who was handsome and always saved me from drowning, twice. My Nan, godmother, Beatrice Hazel, whom they said had married a Turk and was especially fond of me. There is my Aunt Adeline, one of a set of twins. I remember her as being the most beautiful, intelligent, and independent. I intend no slight to the rest of my father's family. They are all characters. There's Aunt Madeline, who is a successful businesswoman and a good dancer with a wonderful sense of humor, and Uncle Henry, the executive, who brought me bright ribbons from funeral bouquets for my hair. This side of my family belonged to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Their hope and their pride was in it. Consequently, they paid little attention to the history of their neighborhood, and I did not find out until 1978 that this had been the site of Mademoiselle Marie Laveau's house. The old folks say that her true home, the place where she held her altar circles on Friday nights, was a simple cabin on the shores of Bayou St. John near Lake Pontchartrain. I tried. Nevertheless, Mama's house was charged with mystery for me. My immediate family moved to the west bank of Mississippi, the mother of rivers, to a small town called the Algiers, where the mysteries continued. Algiers is a place where the Voodoos took refuge in 1850, when New Orleans City Police were conducting frequent surprise raids on their gatherings. The element of secrecy became so important under this oppression that many voodoo practices formerly regulated to the altar circle became integrated into the culture under the guise of common everyday acts. The practitioners infused the most common household items and acts with spiritual power. In this way, they kept their practices but lost much of the accompanying theology. Mamselle used red bricks dust as protection powder and for drawing ritual symbols on the floor during worship. It became a common practice to scrub steps down with red brick dust to protect the home from both human and spiritual intruders as a sign of kinship to other practitioners. In time, scrubbing steps with red brick dust became a sign of cleanliness, and people who use it claim that it sterilizes wood and fills cracks in stone. I remember climbing red scrubbed wooden steps as a youngster, and my mother used to laugh as she told me about my childhood habit of eating red brick dust. I remember many other incidents that hinted at magic too. Our Algiers house was a few doors from a corner liquor store, and the street lights were brighter than the gas lights in the French quarters of New Orleans. I used to stand in front of the liquor store and eavesdrop on the conversations of older folk. I heard many things, most of which made no sense and which I do not remember. One significant statement that I do remember vaguely and can make some sense of went something like, I'm going to go see that old two-headed man, going to get some anisette. Now, I know that a two-headed person is a spiritualist, and anisette is a liquor used to help call down spirits. Late one evening, I was standing on the corner enjoying the liquor store lights and eavesdropping when my mother called me to come inside. I responded, "In a minute, Mama." She squinted her eyes and said, "All right, in a minute. Mark my word, you gonna come running your behind in here." I thought to sabotage the 12-foot journey by walking slowly, dragging my feet, when suddenly out of nowhere a creepy, buzzing, flying thing crash landed on my flat bosom. I screamed, ripping at my clothes, and ran into the house. My mother reached into my she-shirt and pulled out a crushed locust. She threw the thing out the window, and then she scrubbed my chest with a soapy towel. She looked at me and smiled and said, "Child, you's a mess." The cardboard walls had been painted pink. On top of the cedar chest in the front room sat a ceramic cookie jar shaped like a cat. Outside, Mr. Lombard was lifting a block of ice that would be placed in the top of our refrigerator to keep the food cool. My oldest sister, Joyce, was in the kitchen, drying her socks on the kerosene stove. My younger sister, Gloria, was walking sideways across the floor. There was a baby boy, Wilson, in my mama's womb. Miss Victoria next door was pounding on the wall and yelling, "Hold it down, y'all." And my father was carrying a funny-looking square thing with a lot of dials and wires. He plugged it in, turned it on, and little white people started running around and talking crazy inside this box. I had already been mystified by the talking box Mama kept in her room, and now Daddy brought one in with white people running around inside it. This box gave me faces to go with the voices of Amos and Andy. I saw that Sapphire wore ridiculous hats, and her mother stuck her lip out. I saw Buckwheat's hair shoot straight up on his head, and Al Johnson acted really silly with black stuff on his face. Yancey Derringer and his Indian friend Paco shot bad guys on Bourbon Street in Rochester, co-signed for whatever Jack Benny said. Later, I was impressed by the Twilight Zone, Star Trek, Bewitched, Topper, and the Night Gallery. I watched Jason and the Argonauts, and the biblical movies. Television showed me that other people entertained strange thoughts too. But somehow, I never believed that the full moon was really going and doing with the Wolfman in. The backyard of this house was where the bathroom was located. Joyce used to run and lock herself in it to avoid whipping. My mother and I hung clothes on a rope line strung between the fence and a chinnaberry tree. The number 3 tin was usually full of shrimp, crabs, or turtles, which would become dinner. One day, while cleaning oysters, my daddy pulled a loose tooth out of my head. The next day, while Mama was chopping wood, I complained of a headache, and my mother told me a terrifying story. You know, baby, there used to be a little girl that ran around here who was always complaining about her head hurt. One day, she come up talking that when her mama was chopping wood. So her mama says, if your head hurts so bad, baby, let me open it up and see what's in there. So the little girl laid her head down on the chopping block and her mama raised the axe high like this. And that axe came down whop, like that. And do you know what happened? I stood full of wide-eyed wonder. No, ma'am. Cockroaches and whatnot came crawling out of that child's head. You ain't got no cockroaches in your head, do you, baby? Magically, my headache went away. My mother often cured with words. It was getting to be Mardi Gras time. Mama and a woman called Aunt Mary Bell Reed was dressing up for the occasion. They wore blue jeans, a captain's cap with red and white mandarin handkerchiefs tied around their necks. When the band began to play and the people were parading in the streets, they would take the handkerchiefs from their necks and wave them, pass them across the hips and in between their legs in rhythm to a jig known as the handkerchief dance. At other times, they did the second line. I would stand on the banquet or sit on somebody's shoulder and yell, "Throw me something, mister," to a man on the carnival float. Later, we would eat red beans and rice and marvel at Mardi Gras beads and mock gold doubloons. In the house behind us on the next street lived a Chinese woman, whose name I never knew. She had many nice trees in her yard, and a particular two that held my interest, a pear tree, and one that bore a fruit we called hopanicas, loquats. I used to slip over the fence and help myself to these delicious fruit until one day I approached the pear tree and found a leopard cub chained to its lowest branch. The teeth of the animal told me that this was not my imagination at work. Needless to say, after that, I got my fruit from the vendor man when he came by in his truck crying, "Watermelon, get your ripe melon today, lady." My family's next move was to a small backwoods area called Harvey. We lived in the Gem Homes, a subdivision for coloreds. It was so beautiful. The land was green. We had willows and magnolias, banana trees, orange and lemon trees. The crickets and the frogs sang at night, and the light bulbs dotted the darkness with yellow light. Rattlesnakes and cottonmouth moccasins curled up in the blackberry bushes, and once in a while some bold alligator would show himself in public and end up on the dinner table. People fed their dogs gunpowder and ground beef before they left for the hunt. I loved this place where all of nature seemed to talk to me. In this neck of the woods, everybody talked in proverbs, worked on the riverfront or in white folks' homes, and had a home remedy for every illness or mental condition. I was 7 now, the mystical age for Southern blacks, and my mother was no longer responsible for my sins. I was taught carefully how to conduct myself. When you see people on the street, you say good morning because you didn't sleep with them last night. If you go next door to borrow a cup of sugar, you take a stick of butter or 2 yard eggs to the person you are borrowing from. If you're at somebody's house, come supper time and they don't offer you a plate, you get up quietly and leave. You don't allow nobody to talk bad about your mama. If they do, you have to fight. Otherwise, nobody will respect you. You don't call folks out of their name. You don't curse them. You say yes, ma'am, and no, sir, to everybody who is grown. And you don't question your elders about nothing. You just listen to what they have to say. You watch out for the neighborhood children when their parents are away at work or church. You never make fun of deformed or crazy people. Interestingly, alcoholism and homosexuality fell into this category because everybody's got a cross to bear. You don't sit around people's house when they are cleaning up. You make yourself useful by washing dishes or taking out the garbage. If you're visiting with somebody and they accidentally sweep your feet, get up and leave. When it's thundering and lightning, you put away all the things metal and sit still because God is talking. And you fight until you win or lose, but you never run from a fight. Now, I began to take special notice of the women in my community. It seems I had a mother on every block. This, of course, was a double-edged sword. On one side, I could not go hungry or fall down sick without auntie, cousin, sister, or big mama so-and-so doing something about it. On the other hand, if I committed a transgression 6 blocks away from home, I could get at least 5 scoldings and 2 whippings before I got home to receive the final one. When a woman was in my neighborhood had a baby, the neighborhood women slaughtered and fatted calf, so to speak, and fed her other children, cleaned her house, and visited steadily for the next 2 weeks. They'd always comment on the arrival of the child. She's a spitting image of her father. Months later, they would say, the child was beginning to look like her mother more and more. They'd examine the child's hands and comment that she had piano or pickpocket fingers. If she had piano fingers, when she began to crawl, somebody would give the child a toy piano. The child with pickpocket fingers would be given a small allowance for performing some task and a lecture about how a lazy person can't make it in this world. They'd look in the face of the baby and remark that this was one of an old soul. Or they'd ask the child, who are you and what you come here for? I listened to the older women interpret each other's dreams and watched them take precautions against their predictions. If they dreamed of a wedding, they checked on the old folks because somebody was about to die. Then they would open a Bible to the 23rd Psalm and place a lit candle on top of it. If they dreamed of fish, somebody was about to be yumsa, pregnant. When the pregnant woman began to show, they would rub her belly to determine whether if it was a boy or a girl. Boys sat in the belly like watermelons. Girls sat round like pumpkins. After birth, a woman took Lydia E. Pinkhin vegetable compound to settle her womb. Younger women took quinine and turpentine to bring their periods down. All the teenage girls struggled to be virtuous, but nature had to take its course. And a girl who had waited too late to marry might find that her nature had backed up on her and would go crazy. When a boy and a girl were born in different families in the same year, the mothers joked about them marrying each other. A lot of times, the kids actually did marry later. Now, my mother began to say to me that I was Catholic. Her policy was God by any means necessary. Although I was Catholic, I could go to the nearest church regardless of its denomination. A socio-political factor was involved here. The nearest Catholic church for coloreds was All Saints in Algiers, now 2 or 3 towns away. St. Rosalie's was in Harvey, but was on the other side of the highway and was reserved only for white folks. And without my mother's knowledge or permission, I was one of the first little black girls to integrate the Mass at St. Rosalie, an act that got me chased across the highway by white boys with sticks and stones. So most of the time I went to the local Saintfield church, headed by a powerful black man named Elder Mack. Elder Mack would hold his ear and preach till his head was dripping without sweat. Once in a while, he'd remind us that before God touched him, he almost killed a man. Wondrous things happened in this church. They played tambourines and sang heart-rendering songs. People would get possessed by the Holy Spirit and talk in tongues. Once I saw a crippled man throw down his crutches and run like an athlete out of that church. There were seats of honor, the deacon's bench, and the mother's bench. Occasionally, they gave a heaven and hell party to raise funds for the church. Here's how it works. The sinners come and buy a plate of chicken or fried fish and a beer. They stayed outside and danced to the music of a recorded player. The saints also buy a plate and a cold drink, soft drink, soda, or coffee, and they sit inside and read the Bible or sing gospel songs. I, of course, always went to hell at these fundraisers. There were prayer meetings almost every night and candlelit processions at least once a year. My mother came to the sanctified church sometimes, but more and more she reminded me that I was Catholic. Once in a while, she would remind me of the promise she had made to Papa, her father, on his deathbed. "Don't let my grandchildren grow to be no sand dancers," were among his last words. Sand dancers are spiritualists who draw insignia on the floor in the same way that Mademoiselle used brick dust. They do the ring shout dance and bring down the Holy Spirit. My mother did some curious things like cleaning her house with holy water taken from the Catholic Church. When my brother had a nosebleed, she wet a piece of brown paper bag, held it to his nose, and she put a key on a shoestring, tied it around his neck, and dropped it down his back. The bleeding stopped. She was always talking to the elements. Once I watched her invoke the rain. She explained to the clouds how much we needed the water. Later that night, it rained. If it rained while the sun was shining, she'd say, "Damn it, the devil is beating his wife again." I saw her talk to a frog, calling it by the name of a neighbor man who had died. The frog hopped into the house of this man and took place in the middle of the living room floor. She called the frog by the man's name and told him to go back from where he came, and the frog politely left the room. It was common knowledge in our family that you had to avoid Mama's pointed finger at all costs because whatever she said, calling the names of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as she pointed that dreaded finger, that came to pass. She had pointed that finger at me when the locust landed in my bosom. I was deeply impressed by this fact. But as was typical of child-rearing practices in the old black South, nobody taught me anything about these mysteries. Often I would stand quietly nearby as some dream was being interpreted, only to be dismissed with, "This is a racehorse conversation and no jackasses allowed," which meant that I should leave because their conversation was beyond my understanding. An ever-sealed lid of secrecy covered what older folks said and did. Later, I learned that this secrecy had been a survival mechanism. Under slavery, the penalty for retaining African ways and beliefs was death. The black codes of Louisiana forbade black people to gather in large numbers unsupervised. Therefore, the Voodooistas had held their ceremonies at night on Lake Pontchartrain and in Congo Square, around the corner from my grandmother's house. In this neighborhood, when a person went to the local grocery store to buy a pound of beans, a pound of rice, and a piece of salt pork, the neighborhood merchant in the register would ring up the price of the things, collect the money, and give change. Then she would reach over in the vegetable bin and pull out a nice round onion, drop it in the bag, smile, and say, "Legenipe." The buyer would smile and nod and walk pleased as punch from the store. She had been given Legenipe, a little something extra to make her meal complete. Everybody did it. Nobody discussed it. We learned and played and cried and laughed and grew up like all the children, but for those of us who came at the age of Mississippi Basin, the remnants of voodoo, the whispered wisdoms, were the Legenipe of our developing consciousness. In her 30s, my mother was a beautiful woman. You're still pretty hot for your age, girlfriend. She has soft brown hair and changeable brown eyes. When she bought stockings, the shade was titled Honeytail Royale. She was small-breasted, small-waisted, with a belly that speaks of birthing. As to her hips, we used to tease her by singing, "It must be jelly, 'cause jam don't shake like that." She is a woman of good health and physical strength, courageous and independent spirit, with a gift for transmitting knowledge if she chooses to. I count myself lucky to have been her third of 9 children. Conceitedly, I say that I experienced my mother at her peak. We spent hours at the kitchen table cooking and looking at the world through the window fan. We made court bouillon, fish head stew, and Creole pralines, candy. Creole cabbage, stuffed crab, gumbo, and alligator pears, avocado with spices, codfish balls and sweet potato pies, lemon pies, and homemade ice cream, banana and peach. We skinned catfish, they menstruate, eel and armadillo. We ate Creole cream cheese, not at all like Philadelphia, and French bread for breakfast. Sipped coffee with chicory from a demi-tasse cup. We stewed chicken, fried roe, fish eggs, and once in a while had alligator's tail. We planted a garden and built a chicken coop, caught crawfish and blew bubbles through the gutter reeds. We washed our faces in watermelon rind. She made ointment from a prickly pear, wrapped my hair in number 8 black thread, and strung the braids together. We told each other stories, and we stitched soft moccasins and listened for death ticking in the woodwork. She never thought of her omens and cures as voodoo. To her, they were simply mother wit, or what the old folks say. My mother's stories about her family were most interesting to me. Her father, Papa Wyatt Scott, had been a slave as a child. He had been shipped to Virginia from the Big Island, Haiti. to probably work the plantation. Somehow, he did time round Georgia, then was sent back to Virginia. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we don't know when he was born, the freedom come, and he took himself a wife, one Mary Jones, the daughter of Rachel, a Chautauqua, and a Frenchman whose name was Silas. Wyatt and Mary had 5 children, the Brownskins. My aunt Elizina, Dorothea, who still lives, but is little known to me, and Uncle Bill, who was a character worth his weight in gold. There's the black-skinned moon-faced Johnny, who was an ancestor now, and Charlie Scott, whose legend says he went up north and passed for white. The baby girl, Serena the Redskin, is my mother. Mary Jones died young, when my mother was 7. Elzina struck out on her own, leaving the baby girl to cook, clean, and manage the house for 3 men. Papa Scott never married again, and in fact, never even brought another woman into his house. My mother lived for the stories of her mother. Papa went to sleep when I was 3, so I lived for the stories of Papa and Big Mama, as she would have been called if she lived. According to my mother and my Uncle Bill, there are 2 outstanding stories about these grandparents. The first is as follows. In the year before Big Mama died, Papa came down with pneumonia. He was taken to a place where colored people were treated, and after examination, the white doctor told Big Mama to build a pine box coffin for him. Big Mama took him home and said that she would not let him die. She braided her long black hair in Indian pigtails, put on a particular dress and her moccasins, and walked out into the swamplands. She was gone 3 days and 3 nights. She came back with a handful of green berries, which she boiled into tea and fed to Papa. In a few days, Papa got out of that bed and lived a vigorous life for another 30 years. He was killed in a hit-and-run accident. The story is this. Papa was a railroad man. At some point in his life, he had lost one leg from the knee down as it got caught in the hitch between 2 boxcars. Papa used to sit on his front porch in Slidell, Louisiana, with a greedy-brimmed hat pulled down over his eyes and his one leg cocked up on the porch rail. People always thought that he was asleep, but he could tell you everything that had happened in the community that morning. In those days, white people used to call all older black people auntie and uncle, a habit they had adopted from the slaves. It seems that the sheriff of Slidell imagined he had some business with Papa and proceeded to disturb his sleep by pulling on his leg and calling, "Uncle, hey, Uncle." Papa opened his eyes and said, "When did a black man, some bitch like me, get to be your uncle?" He reached under his seat and opened rifle fire that sent the sheriff hightailing to visit another uncle. He got the reputation for being a crazy nigger, and the white men of that town left him alone in general. There were other stories that went past my ears as my mother tried to reconstruct the history of a family torn apart by slavery and poverty. Somewhere on the island, Papa had a sister named Serena like my mother. I listened carefully and stored away in my head everything that was said around me. I still amazed my mother by being able to recount stories she had almost forgotten. This is what the children of former slaves, migrant workers, and immigrants must do to maintain our sanity. The stories of our elders are all we have to reconstruct a lost past. Mama doesn't realize it yet, but she was an armchair feminist. The principles for living that she instilled in me as a child have simply been extended to apply to society. She used to say, "Don't allow anybody to walk over you. If you ain't got but a dime in your pocket, walk with your head up and get your back straight. You can be anything you want to be, goddammit, and be the best, whatever it is." The difference between reward and punishment in our household was dependent on your ability to demonstrate to Mama that you were thinking, that you were minding what you were doing. You had to prove that all your senses had been applied to the situation, including your 6th sense. We used to see a neighborhood man stumbling home drunk at night, and she would say, "You see, baby, everybody looks at him and says, 'Poor man, he had a way to go.' If I stumbled in the street like that, and they'd call me a whore and a tramp, and I'd got problems too." As I grew older, I too experienced the isolation and false shame women are often subjected to, and I learned to regard the fear of gossip as a terrible power. My mother used to tell me to keep $1 and a dime in my wallet. This was independence insurance. If you were riding in a car with a boy and he started pulling at you, you could use the dime to make a phone call and the dollar to get a cab, or pay somebody for a ride to the nearest friend or relative's house. The women of my community generally agreed that men had more dog in them than women did. They said that all men were children. When this logic failed in an argument, when his logic failed in an argument with his wife, the man only had to shake his fist and say, "I'm a man." And as most often, the fuss stopped. Some of the men abused their wives. A young girl about to be married was told by older women that she should count on getting hit before too long. She was told that he was bound to change on her, and she was taught that Louisiana women's self-defense techniques: money hidden away, a friend girl who keep your kids for a while, and T-roll, fighting combinations: boiling hot grits with honey or sugar and oil to throw in his face, a kick to the groin, 2 finger pokes for the eye, and press the thumb down in the opening of his throat. These things would let him know that she was a lil piece of leather and well put together. My mother was always predicting accurately for people or praying somebody out of a fix. Once I got bold and asked her to teach me how to work the spirits. She looked at me intently and said, "I ain't gonna teach you nothing, your temper too bad." She said nothing more until I called her years later. I casually informed her that I needed some gopher dust, graveyard dirt. She gave me a lecture about using that stuff and advised a cleaner course of action. It was a trick I'd used to get her to talk. She said I used to read and work the spirits for people, but most folks are just too suspicious and cunning, so I asked the spirits to leave me. But the spirits did not leave her. She has simply redirected her powers and restricted their use to her family. I have inherited her unfinished community work. Ages 9 to 14 brought a panorama of nightmare visions. At 10, I began to menstruate and discovered that there was another area of my life surrounded by secrecy. Suddenly, I was a woman. A dreadful thing had happened to me. I was unclean, sick, and a candidate for ruination, a word used to mean rape and pregnancy. At the same time, I heard whispers that my menstrual blood could be used to work magic. With it, I could steal a man's nature. I was told that the space between my legs would cause me to carry many a day. Corresponding with the onset of puberty came a change in my father. The man who had been king and distant daddy hung up his choir robe and began a one-man campaign to make my life miserable. Suddenly he complained that I was stupid, ate too much, was ugly, and would never amount to anything. At first I tried to prove to him that I was good. I brought home straight A report cards, got parts in school days, stayed away from the boys, sang in the church choir, kept as quiet as I could, and did everything I could think of to please him, but nothing did. I equated him with God the Father, the terrible, the powerful, great bearded man in the sky. The man who had all the power. The man who had created Eve as an afterthought. The man who had his only begotten son crucified. I knew other girls who had good relationships with their fathers, but try as I did, mine continued to be an endless source of irritation to me. I used to stand in our backyard, lush, green with St. Augustine grass and banana trees, and stare at the sky. I'd see the bearded white man in the clouds. I tried to talk to him, but the clouds would just dissipate. He was unreasonable. He never answered me. In rage, I'd climb on top of the house and stand defiantly with the clenched fist raised in anger, shaking and screaming inside my head, "I'll get you, you motherfucker. One day I'll whip you." I did not have a good image of God the Father until 1974, when I made personal contact with Abatala, the androgynous sky god of the Yoruba pantheon. He brought me wisdom, humility, and a loving tenderness that I had never known. The first work. Household magic. To spiritually clean a house. Moving clockwise. Place a teaspoon of salt in all the corners of the house, beginning at the front door and ending at the back door. Sprinkle baby rum on the tip of a new broom and beat the walls from top to bottom at the corners. Moving counterclockwise, pick up all the salt from the corners and flush it down the toilet. Now mop the floors in a solution of first urine, drinking a glass of water before retiring, and collect the urine in the morning before doing anything else. 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and perfume. If your home is also your place of business, add 3 pennies or other coins depending on the amount of business you want to attract. And Chinese or Van floor wash, 2 tablespoons. As you are mopping the floor, speak aloud the kind of life you want to live in the house. Do this in each room, throwing water out the back door. Light a blue peace candle behind the front door with an image of St. Michael over the door. Put fresh cut flowers in each room. The first work. Household magic. To spiritually clean a house. Yes, we're going to read this again. Moving clockwise, place a teaspoon of salt in all. Oh my God. We're going to read it again. The first work, household magic. To spiritually clean a house. Moving clockwise, place a teaspoon of salt in all the corners of the house, beginning at the front door and ending at the back door. Sprinkle bay rum on the tip of a new broom and beat the walls from top to bottom at the corners. Moving counterclockwise, pick up all the salt from the corners and flush it down the toilet. Now mop the floors in a solution of first urine. First urine means drink a glass of water before retiring, before going to bed, and collect the urine in the morning when you wake up, before doing anything else. 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and perfume. So that means you need to add 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and perfume to your urine, and that is the solution you're going to mop the floors with. If your home is also your place of business, add 3 pennies or other coins depending on the amount of business you want to attract, and Chinese or Van floor wash. Use 2 tablespoons of Chinese or Van floor wash. As you are mopping the floor, speak aloud the kind of life that you want to live in the house. Do this in each room. Throw the water out of the back door. Light a blue peace candle behind the front door with an image of St. Michael over the door. Put fresh cut flowers in each room. Tomorrow we will continue on. We have ended on page 19 and we are still in the section Growing Up Tipsy. I ask that you all excuse some of my little mispronunciations here or there. We all have our accents. Remember that. And I hope that this reading has been enjoyable for you all today. Please make sure that you have also picked up the text so you can read along. We are going to continue on with pages 20 to 50 tomorrow. Thank y'all for listening. Now, what I want you all to do is also write down some questions and write down some things you learned. I learned a lot of new vocabulary from today's reading. I think there were a lot of things that were funny. I really like the way that this is written. It's written as memoir and storytelling, which I think makes the approach to the subject easier. You know, everyone has their own hoodoo. And so to speak, that means, yes, there are general, and you could even say, right, kind of universal practices if you're hoodoo. But the beautiful and amazing thing about hoodoo is it's focused and I would say rooted in practicality. So it's about doing the best with what you have. And I really love that this is written from more of a storytelling aspect. But you need all of your text. So as important as a text like this is, you also need the others that are very straightforward. Maybe you could say they read more dryly because they're written in more of a research and just more of a, this is what you do, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, ABC format. But like I said, you need all versions. You need it from all angles and all sides. But yeah, I really enjoyed today's reading. We got through pages 1 to 19. I think this will be about an hour long. And I'll be back with you guys tomorrow. We'll be working our way from pages 20 to 45. I might go a little bit past 45, but I definitely do not want to go past page 50. Okay? I love you all. Many blessings, much abundance, and ashe.